the late 1970s, New York City was a place where crime and corruption thrived in the shadows of its towering skyscrapers. It was a city filled with both opportunity and danger, and the criminal world was flourishing. Among the most daring and dangerous criminals was James Burke, also known as Jimmy the Gent. Burke was a trusted member of the notorious Gambino crime family, one of the 5 major mafia families operating in New York. His reputation for executing heists with precision and efficiency made him infamous in the criminal world, and he was known to have a knack for making things disappear without a trace. At the center of Burke's most famous crime stood one of the largest heists in American history, the Lufthansa Heist. It was an audacious and meticulously planned robbery, and its success would depend on flawless execution. Burke, with his Mafia connections, had gathered a group of criminals, each with specialized skills to pull off the job. But the real key to the operation was the inside man, Louis Werner, an employee working at the Lufthansa cargo terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Werner, a cargo supervisor, had access to sensitive information about the airport's operations, including the arrival of flights carrying large sums of cash and valuable cargo. Lufthansa, a German airline, had been known to transport large amounts of money from businesses and banks. The airline's cargo terminal at JFK had become a lucrative target for those in the know. Werner, in his quiet role, would provide vital details to the thieves, helping them pinpoint exactly when and where the money would be kept. He offered them the inside information they needed, when the next shipment of cash would arrive and where it would be stored. The heist was set to take place on December 11, 1978. Burke's team had been observing the airport for weeks, learning the movements of security guards, employees, and the overall layout of the terminal. They knew they needed to move fast, and to do so they had to be in and out of the airport before anyone realized what had happened. The plan was simple but brilliant. Burke and his crew would arrive at the terminal dressed in police uniforms, giving them instant credibility and access to the restricted areas of the airport. On the night of the heist, the criminals executed their plan without hesitation. They breached the terminal, bypassing airport security and security cameras with ease. The crew, appearing as if they were law enforcement officers, moved swiftly through the cargo terminal. They loaded the van with millions of dollars in cash, along with jewelry and other valuables. No one suspected a thing. The heist had been planned so carefully that it seemed as if the thieves were invisible. They took what they wanted and escaped into the night, leaving no immediate evidence behind. For a brief moment, it appeared as though they had pulled off the perfect crime. The criminals had vanished without a trace, and the Lufthansa heist quickly became the stuff of legend. The authorities were left dumbfounded, unable to understand how the thieves had managed to outsmart the airport's security systems. The heist had seemed too perfect, too precise, to be anything but the work of professionals. But the true story of the Lufthansa heist was only beginning to unfold. What appeared to be an untraceable crime would soon spiral into a web of betrayal, violence, and death. Louis Werner was an ordinary man working in an extraordinary place. He wasn't a notorious criminal or a hardened mafia associate. He was simply an employee at the Lufthansa cargo terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport. But in the criminal underworld, Werner's role was far from insignificant. He had something that many criminals desperately needed: access. As a cargo supervisor, Werner was responsible for overseeing shipments, including valuable items, large sums of money, and precious jewels. His job gave him unparalleled access to the workings of the airport and, most importantly, to the flow of goods that moved through the Lufthansa terminal. It was this position that made him an ideal candidate for James Burke and his crew. Burke, a member of the Gambino crime family, had an eye for opportunity, and he quickly realized that inside information was the key to pulling off a heist of this magnitude. The Lufthansa terminal at JFK was a major hub for cargo, and each night, vast amounts of cash and valuables were processed through its vaults. The criminals knew that if they could learn the timing and location of these high-stakes shipments, they could walk away with millions. Werner, for his part, wasn't a seasoned criminal, but he had his own motivations. Like many in the working class, he had dreams of a better life, one where he wasn't bound by the limits of his paycheck. When Burke and his team approached Werner with the plan, they didn't have to twist his arm too much. They offered him a cut of the loot, a life of luxury in exchange for information. It was a temptation Werner couldn't resist, and so he became the inside man. The deal was simple. Werner would provide crucial details about the shipments, the time they would arrive, where they would be stored, and who would be handling them. In return, he would receive a significant portion of the stolen money. With this information, Burke and his crew could execute their plan without error, bypassing the airport's security system and targeting the precise vault where the money was kept. Werner agreed, becoming an unwitting accomplice in a crime that would alter his life in ways he couldn't fully comprehend at the time. For weeks leading up to the heist, Werner played his part with subtlety. He kept his head down at work, pretending nothing was amiss. To avoid suspicion, he had to maintain a facade of normalcy. But as the date of the heist approached, the pressure mounted. Werner knew that if anything went wrong, the consequences would be deadly. Burke and his crew were ruthless, and any betrayal could cost him not just his job, but his life. As the night of December 11th, 1978 drew near, Werner knew exactly what to expect. The cash would be arriving from various businesses and banks, and it would be stored in a secure vault at the terminal. The heist would take place under the cover of night, and the criminals would arrive dressed as police officers, a move that would allow them to bypass airport security without question. Werner made sure to pass along the most critical piece of information, the exact time the shipment would arrive and the route it would take. When the heist unfolded, everything went according to plan. Burke and his crew executed the robbery with military precision. The money was taken without a single shot being fired, and the criminals vanished into the night as though they had never been there. But Werner, despite his initial success, would soon learn that in the world of organized crime, loyalty is fleeting and nothing stays hidden forever. As the investigation began to unfold, the net started to close around him. His role as the inside man had already sealed his fate. Werner's involvement would come to light, but his story was far from over. The FBI would soon begin questioning him, but Werner was stuck between two terrifying worlds: the Mafia's wrath and the long arm of the law. After the Lufthansa heist was carried out with astonishing success, the world was left in shock. The thieves had managed to infiltrate one of the busiest airports in the world, bypassing security and walking away with millions of dollars in cash and jewelry. For a moment, it seemed like the perfect crime. The criminals, masked in police uniforms, had moved through the airport undetected, taken what they wanted, and vanished into the night. But what initially seemed like a flawless operation soon began to unravel in the most unexpected and violent ways. It soon became clear. The most chilling part of the heist was the aftermath. Within weeks of the robbery, the individuals involved in the crime began disappearing. At first, the disappearances were subtle. A few individuals who had been part of the crew simply vanished from the radar, leaving behind few clues. But as time passed, the story became darker. The men who had participated in the heist were being hunted down one by one, not by the police, but by their own associates in the criminal world. James Burke, the mastermind behind the operation, was the first to meet a gruesome end. Burke was known for his ruthlessness and his loyalty to the Gambino crime family, but that loyalty was never guaranteed. He had earned the trust of his Mafia bosses, but the success of the Lufthansa heist would soon prove to be a curse. Burke's involvement in the heist, coupled with the growing tension between him and his partners, led to a chilling conclusion. Authorities found his body in a remote area showing signs of brutal violence. It seemed clear that someone had silenced him to ensure he would never speak about the robbery. Burke's murder marked the beginning of a wave of violence. Members of the crew who had been involved in the Lufthansa heist soon followed him into an early grave. One by one, the thieves who had helped execute the robbery were killed in suspicious and often violent circumstances. The murders sent a clear message. In the Mafia world, no one could be trusted with such a massive score. Greed had driven these men to risk everything, but in the end, it was their greed that led to their undoing. The disappearances and deaths didn't just stop with Burke. Other members of the crew who had been involved in the heist, men who had known too much, seen too much, or simply gotten greedy, were systematically killed off. One man was found shot dead in his car, another was found dumped in a desolate area, and several others vanished without a trace, their bodies never discovered. It was as if the Mafia had decided that anyone who had been a part of the heist could never be allowed to live long enough to tell the tale. The reason behind these murders was not hard to understand. The Mafia's code of silence, known as omerta, demanded that anyone involved in a criminal operation keep quiet, even at the cost of their own lives. Burke's crew had failed to understand that loyalty to the crime family came before any personal gain. The millions of dollars stolen in the Lufthansa heist were far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. While the criminals may have expected to split the loot and disappear into the shadows, they had instead signed their own death warrants. Welcome. Amidst all the violence and disappearances, the investigation into the heist continued. The FBI was determined to track down the perpetrators and recover the stolen money. However, each lead seemed to end in another mysterious death, making the case even more perplexing. Investigators began to piece together a disturbing pattern, realizing that the thieves were not just criminals who had stolen money. They had been entangled in a far deeper web of Mafia connections, and anyone involved in the operation was in grave danger. The true nature of the Lufthansa heist, its connections to organized crime, the Mafia, and the brutal world they inhabited was becoming clearer with each passing day. Despite the mounting evidence, the money was still largely unaccounted for. Some of the stolen cash had been laundered, but much of it remained hidden, lost in the labyrinth of criminal enterprises. Even after the death of so many involved, the stolen millions would never fully be recovered, and the full story of the heist would remain a mystery for years to come. The men who had pulled off the greatest robbery in New York City's history paid a heavy price. Their fate served as a grim reminder that, in the world of organized crime, there are no real winners. Only those who manage to survive longer than the others. As the bodies of those involved in the Lufthansa heist continued to pile up, the investigation into the robbery shifted into higher gear. The FBI, perplexed by the string of disappearances and murders, began to dig deeper into the lives of the criminals behind the heist. It soon became clear that the robbery was far from an isolated crime. It was part of a much larger and more dangerous network of Mafia operations. The more the investigators uncovered, the more the case seemed to spiral into a web of betrayal, violence, and cover-ups, all of which pointed back to the Mafia's deadly grip on the city. The first breakthrough in the investigation came from a surprising source. Henry Hill, a member of the Lucchese crime family who had witnessed much of the violence surrounding the heist, decided to cooperate with the FBI. Hill had long been a fixture in the world of organized crime, but as the body count rose and his own life began to feel threatened, he chose to become a witness for the prosecution. Hill's decision to flip, known as turning rat, was a pivotal moment in the investigation. Hill provided a treasure trove of information, shedding light on the inner workings of the Mafia and its connection to the Lufthansa heist. Through his testimony, the FBI learned about the key players involved, including James Burke, the mastermind who had orchestrated the entire operation. Hill revealed how Burke had meticulously planned the heist, using his connections to the Mafia and his knowledge of the airport to orchestrate the perfect crime. But as Hill's testimony unfolded, it also revealed something far darker: the growing tension between Burke and his crew. While the heist itself had been a success, the aftermath had been filled with violence and distrust. Burke had promised the crew a share of the stolen money, but as time passed, many of the participants began to suspect that Burke had kept more than his fair share. Betrayal was rife within the crew, with some members attempting to double-cross one another in an effort to secure a larger portion of the loot. But the real danger came from within the Mafia. Burke's actions and his control over the stolen money had angered other powerful figures, and those who felt slighted were quick to take matters into their own hands. Hill's revelations about Burke's greed and ruthlessness added another layer of complexity to the investigation. It became clear that the murders of the men involved in the heist were not just a means to cover up the crime. They were a brutal way to maintain control. Anyone who had seen too much or become a liability had to be silenced, and Burke had been the one calling the shots. The sheer number of people who had been eliminated, from low-level criminals to trusted associates, suggested that the Mafia was taking no chances. As the investigation unraveled, the FBI also learned that the stolen money had been funneled into various illegal enterprises, including drug trafficking and other Mafia-controlled businesses. The Mafia had made sure that the money would never trace back to them, laundering it through a network of shell companies and shady operations. Some of the crew members had been involved in this process, and those who had tried to keep their share were often met with fatal consequences. Despite Hill's testimony and the evidence that was slowly building, the full extent of the stolen money remained elusive. Some of it had been recovered, but much had been spent or hidden, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to trace. The investigation was a long, drawn-out process with few definitive answers and many more questions. The ruthless nature of the Mafia made it difficult for anyone to trust what they were being told, and the lingering fear of retribution hung over every step of the investigation. As the pieces of the puzzle continued to come together, the FBI understood that they weren't just dealing with a heist. They were unraveling a deep, dangerous network of organized crime, loyalty, and violence that stretched far beyond New York City. The true cost of the Lufthansa heist wasn't just the millions of dollars that were stolen, but the lives destroyed in its wake. For everyone involved, the rewards of the crime had been short-lived, and the consequences were deadly. Even as the investigation came closer to a resolution, it was clear that no one would ever walk away from this story unscathed. As the FBI closed in on the aftermath of the Lufthansa heist, the sense of inevitability became overwhelming. The crimes were complex, the criminals were ruthless, and the bodies left behind told a chilling tale of greed, betrayal, and retribution. The investigation into the heist, one of the most daring and infamous robberies in history, was a slow-burning process that involved not just the theft of millions, but the unraveling of a deep, dangerous underworld. The criminals involved in the Lufthansa heist would soon learn that in the world of organized crime, there was no escape from the consequences of their actions. The key figure behind the heist, James Burke, had orchestrated the robbery with the meticulous precision of a seasoned criminal mastermind. But Burke's desire to keep all of the stolen money for himself would prove to be his undoing. As the investigation deepened, law enforcement discovered the web of deceit and greed that had led to the deaths of several of Burke's associates. Burke's Mafia connections were a double-edged sword. While they had facilitated the heist, they also made him a target. His power, built on intimidation and fear, had come at a steep price. The body of James Burke was found in 1982, years after the heist itself. He had been brutally murdered, his body dumped in a remote area as a stark message from those who felt betrayed by his actions. Burke's death was the first in a long line of killings that would follow. It became clear that the men involved in the heist had made one fatal mistake. They had trusted too many people with their knowledge of the crime. In the world of the Mafia, this was a cardinal sin. Once the money had been stolen and the operation had been completed, there was no room for loose ends. Each person who had played a part in the heist, no matter how minor, had to be eliminated to prevent any chance of the truth being exposed. Burke's murder was just the beginning. The men who had helped execute the Lufthansa heist soon began to disappear. One by one they were found dead, their bodies left to rot in secluded locations. Their deaths were often violent, brutal beatings or gunshot wounds, but always with one chilling similarity. They were killed by people who had once been their associates. The Mafia had decided that anyone involved in the Lufthansa heist could never be allowed to live. As the list of the dead grew longer, the Mafia's message became clear. Betrayal would not be tolerated. The killings were a calculated effort to prevent any of the criminals involved from spilling secrets about the heist. While the thieves had believed they could walk away with their share of the stolen money, they were unaware of the danger that would follow. The Mafia, recognizing the potential for greed and mistrust to destroy their carefully laid plans, acted swiftly to silence those who knew too much. Some of the men who had been part of the operation had tried to get away with their cut of the stolen millions, but in doing so they had put themselves in direct conflict with powerful Mafia figures who were determined to control the entire operation. As the death toll mounted, the FBI began to piece together the true scale of the operation. They had learned about the laundering of the stolen money, the Mafia's role in helping hide the loot, and the ruthless way in which Burke had eliminated anyone who had threatened to expose him. But despite their efforts, the full extent of the heist's aftermath remained elusive. The money itself had become nearly impossible to trace. Some of it had been spent, others laundered through various criminal enterprises, but a large portion of it had simply vanished. The criminal network that had helped facilitate the robbery made sure to cover their tracks, and most of the stolen money was lost in the labyrinth of organized crime. For Louis Werner, the inside man who had provided the crucial information to Burke's crew, the end of the line came slowly. Werner had hoped that by cooperating with the criminals, he could secure a better life for himself. But as the investigation closed in on him, Werner's world crumbled. His role in the heist was eventually discovered, and though he tried to distance himself from the violence that followed, the Mafia saw him as an expendable liability. Werner was arrested and sentenced to prison for his part in the heist, but the consequences of his actions extended far beyond his time behind bars. He, too, was forced to live in fear, knowing that the Mafia had no mercy for those who betrayed them, even indirectly. The story of the Lufthansa heist was one of spectacular success, followed by a swift and violent downfall. The stolen millions were never fully recovered, and the criminals who had masterminded the operation were either dead or imprisoned. The consequences of the heist reached far beyond the crime itself, destroying the lives of those involved and unraveling the fabric of the criminal network that had supported it. As for the Mafia, they had proven once again that in their world, no one could be trusted, not even their own. The story of the Lufthansa heist became a legend in the annals of American crime. It was a tale of ambition, greed, and betrayal, where even the perfect crime couldn't protect the criminals who had pulled it off. And in the end, the heist proved to be more than just a robbery. It was a deadly game in which the price of betrayal was paid in blood.